Welcome to day 3 of the biology unit. Today we're going to be discussing the brain. We're basically going to be taking a tour of the brain and taking a look at some of the major parts and regions of the brain and what behaviors they are most associated with. And you may wonder exactly how do we understand all of this? And there's a variety of ways that we can. One way is studying people that have had damaged brains and damages in specific areas. And then we kind of note their deficits and then do autopsies after they die and see exactly what regions were damaged and draw that correlation. And we also do studies in which we draw correlations between regions of the brain being purposely damaged in animals and seeing what types of behaviors they're lacking after that. So we're going to start off basically with the innermost regions of the brain. And you can almost think of a brain like a big lollipop here. And the stick of that lollipop is going to be your brainstem. And the brainstem, we're going to talk about really 3 different formations that are part of your brainstem. The brainstem is really that portion that's going to connect the spinal cord to the brain. And it's going to deal with a lot of your most basic life functions. And so we start off with the medulla. The medulla is at the base of the brainstem. It's a little slight swelling there, and it is going to control some of your basic functions such as heartbeat and breathing. And so, if you're going to take a cat, for example, and damage the medulla, lesion the medulla, then obviously you'd have a cat that wouldn't last very long. And it's one of the ways that we understand exactly what's going on here. It's going to control basically heartbeat and breathing. It's going to help regulate that. There's other regions of the brain that regulate it more efficiently, but it's going to help to work in that process. Just above that is the pons. The pons helps to coordinate movements. It's also going to be the region of the brain stem that's going to shut off a lot of the brain signals that are being sent to the rest of the body during sleep. And so that's going to be important as we experience sleep paralysis, which all of us experience as we're asleep, and our pons cuts off those signals that are going to the rest of the body to make sure that we are still and safe and not damaging ourselves while we're asleep. The final region of the brainstem is the reticular formation. The reticular formation is going to be responsible for arousal. And what we mean by arousal here is it's regulating the transitions between being awake and being asleep. That transition between wakefulness and again, sleepiness is going to be controlled by the reticular formation. Atop all of that is the thalamus. The thalamus is going to process any sensory information that's coming in aside from smell. Smell has its own separate system. So any sight, any sound, any touch, those types of things are coming through the thalamus. And in fact, so for example, if you see something with your right eye, it's going to go through the thalamus and they get processed in your left brain visual cortex. As our brain is crosswired, as we'll get into a little bit later. Okay, so the thalamus is this innermost region of the brain. And from an evolutionary point of view, it is the oldest in terms of development. It is the one we share with the largest number of other species out there. And if you take a look at our brainstem and take a look at the brainstem of a cat and take a look at the brainstem of a lizard, they're not really all that different. There's some basic anatomical similarities that are true across the board. At the bottom rear of the brain, we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum means little brain, and the reason it's called that is because it kind of looks like that. It has 2 hemispheres, just like the larger brain does. And these hemispheres are helping to coordinate voluntary movements. They're helping to also process what we call procedural memories. So we have David Beckham here playing soccer. Those voluntary movements are being coordinated, but also the exact skills necessary to play soccer are something that are really processed by the cerebellum. And so if David Beckham were to experience amnesia tomorrow and not be able to process any new memories, he'd be able to hold on efficiently to these soccer memories and these soccer skills because it's processed in a different region than those conscious memories that would be associated typically with amnesia. The limbic system. A lot of neuroscientists have a problem with calling the limbic system a system. System we typically think of, a group of coordinated parts that are working towards some sort of coordinated outcome. And the limbic system isn't quite like that. It has a variety of parts that aren't all necessarily working together at the same time. But some of the major components of what has traditionally been known as the limbic system is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a small region of the brain situated just in front of and near the brainstem. It is going to regulate some of the body's basic drives, hunger, thirst, sex, those types of things. It's also going to regulate body temperature and help to regulate that process. It's also going to be the region of the brain that is coordinating with the pituitary gland and using the pituitary gland to really regulate our endocrine system, the processing of hormones throughout the body. The next region of the limbic system is the amygdala. There's the amygdala on either side of the brain. The amygdala is some of our emotional centers of the brain, and specifically, it is most linked to aggression, anger, and fear. And a lot of the research that's been done on the amygdala has shown some clear pathways through the amygdala that process those emotions. And then finally, with the limbic system, we have the hippocampus. The hippocampus, again, we have one in each hemisphere of our brain. And the hippocampus is responsible for memory consolidation, not memory storage, memory consolidation. And what we mean by that is any new information that you're taking in that is going to ultimately be transferred to long-term memory. The hippocampus is responsible for that transference. And as it does that, it is going to process and help to store those memories in other regions of the brain. It seems to do a lot of this process during sleep, and because of that, the hippocampus is often very active during sleep, especially during a specific stage of sleep called REM sleep that is most associated with memory consolidation. Now, as we move further out of our lollipop of the brain, we get to the outer layer of the brain, which we call the cortex. The cortex is the part of the brain that you can see without cutting into it. It's the wrinkly outer layer of the brain. It's wrinkly for a reason. The wrinkles allow us to have more surface area of the brain and therefore allow us to be able to process more information more efficiently. And if you compare us to other less intelligent animals, you're going to notice that their cortices are a lot smoother, have less brain, cortex surface area, and therefore less ability to process higher level functioning. As we go through the cortex, there's a variety of regions that we need to know. And one is the motor cortex. The motor cortex is a region that's in the very rear of the frontal lobe of the brain. We'll talk about lobes in just a little bit. The motor cortex is going to process voluntary muscle movement. So your ability to move your arms, legs, fingers, etc. All of that is processed by the motor cortex. Now, if you look at that kind of odd-looking diagram at the bottom left, you're going to notice that there's kind of a map of the body that is drawn next to the motor cortex. And you'll notice that it is disproportionate in size. Certain regions of the body are drawn larger than others. And what that is meant to represent is that the motor cortex does not treat the body equally. Those regions of the body that require more fine muscle movements in order to accomplish their tasks have more of the motor cortex dedicated to them. So you notice a really large mouth and lips, for example. And if you think about it, the ability to talk and use language requires really sophisticated movements of the mouth, the lips, the tongue, all in a very fine-tuned, coordinated way. And therefore, it requires a lot of the motor cortex to really be able to process language and to speak efficiently and coordinate all those movements to speak efficiently. And so it takes up a lot of the motor cortex. On the other hand, something like, for example, the trunk of the body. The trunk of the body can move, and obviously those movements are important, but it doesn't have a lot of fine movements. It doesn't have a lot of really movements that have to be very precise in their motions. You'll also notice that on the hands, the thumb is much larger than the rest of the fingers. The thumb is the one that is most used for gripping and for being able to make those precise movements with the hand. A couple of things about the motor cortex. First of all, again, like the rest of the brain, it is cross-wired, meaning that the motor cortex in the left hemisphere is going to control movement on the right side of the body. So if you were to have a stroke that bleeding on the brain, that it's going to damage brain tissue, it's going to that affects your left motor cortex. You would lose muscle movement in the right side of your body as your brain's not able to control that. A second thing to understand about the brain is that the brain is plastic, and what we mean by that is that it can change its functions over time. And so if you were, for example, to be in an accident and lose your right thumb, the region of the motor cortex that was associated with coordinating the movements of that right thumb, it's not going to just go dormant. Instead, it's going to start to be allocated to helping other regions of the body. And typically it gets allocated to helping regions of the body that are closest to it in the motor cortex. So for example, if you lost your right thumb, the regions of the brain that controlled that would then start to help with the processing of, say, movements of the right fingers as well. Okay, so motor cortex is processing those voluntary muscle movements. The sensory cortex is just behind the motor cortex. It is in the very front of the parietal lobe of the brain, and it follows a lot of the same principles of the motor cortex in that it has different amounts of it allocated to different regions of the body. It's a little bit different in that now we're focused on which regions of the body have the greatest sensitivity to touch. So it's less about the need for precise movements and more about sensitivity to touch. And so, some regions are the same, such as certainly the mouth is going to be both useful for fine movement and also sensitive to touch, but not all of them are going to be the exact same size. For example, the sensory cortex associated with the foot is going to be a little bit larger than the motor cortex associated with the foot. It's also cross-wired like the motor cortex, and so that information coming from your right hand is being processed by your left sensory cortex as well. All right, so those are our motor and sensory cortices. One last note about the sensory cortex. When we're talking about a sensory cortex, we're really only talking about one specific sense, and that is the sense of touch. And so sometimes it's referred to as a somatosensory cortex, somato referring to that sense of touch. All right, some other major cortices. The auditory cortex is going to process, obviously, audition or sound. Again, cross-wired information coming from your right ear is going to go into your left auditory cortex. You would think that it wouldn't. The auditory cortex is located right by the ear, but again, it is cross-wired there. And part of the reason it does that is because it's all going through that central thalamus first anyway. The auditory cortices are located in the temporal lobes, which are on either side of the brain. In the very rear of the brain, in the occipital lobe, we have our visual cortex. Again, cross-wired, left eye goes to right side of the brain, right eye goes to left side of the brain. And the visual cortex, as we'll talk about a little bit later, has some specified regions. In other words, there's some regions of the visual cortex that are meant to process specifically faces, for example. But in general, it's located in the occipital lobe processing vision. All right, the final region of the cortex is the rest of it, really, that we haven't already talked about. And the rest of it we refer to as association areas. These areas are regions of the brain that are not dedicated to a specific motor function or specific sensory function. And these are regions of the brain that are going to process those higher level cognitive skills that humans have and humans are superior at compared to any other species. So we're talking about critical thinking. We're talking about language. We're talking about problem solving. We're talking about long-term sophisticated memory. And so if you take a look at these pictures, we're taking a look at a series of, from right to left, less and less sophisticated animals in terms of their thinking. And you'll notice that there's less area dedicated to association areas when you go from, say, chimpanzee to cat. And also the whole cortex in general gets smoother, and therefore less information is being processed. Now, we could take a look at how this whole cortex processes, for example, language, and how something that is as sophisticated and complex as language really requires the coordination of a lot of different regions of the cortex. So let's imagine that you are reading something. As you're reading something, that language is going into your visual cortex initially as written words, but we don't process language really visually. We process language in more of an auditory form. So there's a region of the brain that we don't necessarily need to know for this class, but called the angular gyrus. It's going to help to transform that from visual information into a more of an auditory code. As it gets transferred into an auditory code, it's processed initially in this area of the brain called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is your ability to interpret auditory information. And we know this because people with damaged Wernicke's areas have an inability to understand and interpret information that's coming into them. So they can't really understand people that are talking to them. They can't understand written word. They wouldn't be able to understand signed words or braille or any other way of processing language, because it's all going to be processed in this exact same way. In addition to not being able to understand auditory code, they therefore also have difficulty producing language that is in any way coherent. For those of us with normal functioning brains, the information is then going to go to Broca's area that's going to control speech. And so if we're reading this information out loud, Broca's area is going to process this speech information and prepare us to our motor cortex to move our mouth in a specific way to process this speech. So if you had a damaged Broca's area, you would be able to understand what someone is saying to you, but your speech might be halting. It might have, you might have an inability to form certain words. You might really struggle and be slow with speech because of the damage to that area. When we talk about language deficits as a result of damage to certain brain areas, there's a specific term that we use for that called aphasia, A-P-H-A-S-I-A. And so we can talk about Broca's aphasia, the inability to produce language, or Wernicke's aphasia, the inability to understand language and auditory code. And so this is all just one example of how with complex tasks that the human brain is able to do, it really requires the coordination of a lot of different regions of the brain in order to process those tasks. All right, that ends our tour of the brain today. If you have any questions, you can email me at ghsteacher@gmail.com, or you can ask them in class. Otherwise, good night.